Good evening, everyone. My name is John Espy. I'm the treasurer here at Milford Schools, and welcome to Milford Schools 101. We're going to be going over the 5-year forecast tonight and just talking through some items that make that up. I plan to go over also some important financial data for the school district, talk about the revenues, talk about the expenditures, and also just take some questions as well. So if you do have a question, just for those that are at home, if you could come up and ask into the microphone. I'm fine if I'm on a slide and you raise your hand and you have a question about it, just go ahead and let me know at that point, and we'll answer it and keep going forward. And I just really appreciate you all being here this evening to learn about where we are financially as a school district and kind of where we're going with some projects. So as we look at what the 5-year forecast is and why we do it, it's Ohio Administrative Code and Ohio Revised Code that we have to do this. We have to file forecasts in November, and also in May. It used to be an October forecast, but it was pushed back to November because some districts would be on the ballot for a levy, and then immediately the forecast would be incorrect depending on how the ballot item turned out. So that's why a couple years ago, the state moved that requirement to November. When we look at what the 5-year forecast is, it is looking at specifically the general fund. And that is what we call the 001 fund. We have several different funds, as you can see up here. The federal grants are the 500s, state grants are the 400s. We have 018s, which are typically called principal accounts, where principals would do fundraisers at their buildings and basically hold that money for items that they wanted to use on the students in their buildings. But again, we're looking at the general fund. That's not to say that there's not interplay with other funds that we have on the general fund that do impact the forecast. I wanted to talk because I'd had a couple community members ask questions about ESSER funds, and this stands for Elementary Secondary School Emergency Relief. I know that's a mouthful, but that's what that stands for. There's also coronavirus relief funds, which are called CRF funds. And when you look at the district total on these funds, it's a little bit over $7 million. We've spent a lot of these funds already, but we've earmarked all of the funds. So it's almost a timing issue when you look at the remaining budgeted. It is budgeted. There are projects going on like HVAC. But you can see here how we broke down those expenditures: curriculum and instruction, safety and cleaning, personnel, and technology. A lot of the personnel items happened during the 2020-21 school year, where there was an Eagle Online for K through 6 students, or it might have been K through 8 students, but K through 8 students. So I'm seeing some head nods there, so thank you for helping me out with that. I can still claim new guy status, I think, because it's only been a couple months, so I appreciate the help there. And then also technology. And I like to put this into perspective. So when we look at what our planned expenditures are for this fiscal year, which is the 22-23 school year, $80.6 million, and if you divide that $7 million by our planned expenditures, it's 8.7%. It's important to note here with this that we didn't receive these funds all in one fiscal year, so it's really like breaking it up, but I like putting it into perspective this way so you can see just how much it could go to 1 year's of expenditures. The other thing that I look at here is the district did not utilize a ton of these funds, or a large portion of these funds, on staffing. Most of it was on upkeep or things reacting to COVID, and so that is actually helping the district out by not having a huge fiscal cliff that is falling off of in terms of staffing and personnel and benefits. Also, I've had some questions lately about casino revenue. A lot of people have asked questions and said, where's the casino revenue? Isn't it supposed to help the schools out a ton? When you look at this, you put it into perspective, our casino revenues for fiscal year 22 account for 0.5% of our revenue. When you look at our projection of revenues in fiscal year 23, that 0.5% holds true still. So it is a small portion of our revenue as a school district. When we look at kind of how we got here in terms of the forecast, I had shown this at the last board meeting, but it kind of breaks down a lot of the capital improvements that the board has voted on, where you look at August 22 approves the auditorium renovation. In October 22 approves the athletic facility. November 22 approved Mr. Rabe's forecast at that time. In January, I presented the board with an amended forecast, and that was based off of new information that we had in terms of our expenditures related to all of the capital improvements, how we were planning on borrowing to make those capital improvements, and also the millage it would take to raise. We would have to ask the public to raise in order to be able to pay the bills. When we look forward in February, the board approved financing for the athletic facility. And it's probably a week before the financial committee meeting prior to the March meeting, I started to hear individually from a couple board members that that levy millage ask was not palatable to the public. And so I was given, direction at that point, and also further directed at the finance committee meeting to go back and find additional ways to lower that millage. And so what I did is I presented that to the board in the March 2023 board meeting that was just last week, and the board approved a new way of financing those capital expenditures that spread the cost over 29 years. It should also be noted that back here, when the board approved initially the first plan for financing, that was only covering a part of the athletic facility. So this plan that was approved in March 2023 actually looks at the overage from the middle school project, which is projected to be 9.5 million. By the end of the project, currently it's sitting at 7.5 million. It also addresses the auditorium renovation. It also addresses the athletic facility, as well as creates some contingency for those projects. Okay, I thought I saw a hand go up. So going over that, this is what was done actually at that March meeting, where we look at the COPS financing. It flattens out expenditures and it lowers the levy millage request. And again, here you can see that $600,000 that is set aside for contingency. Yes? It's a certificate of participation. It's basically a lease purchase. So essentially the land is being leased and the building is being built on top of it, and over time the district pays that off, and it's just essentially a way to finance that building that sits on top of it. What's that? We do own the land, but we're essentially leasing the land and issuing debt on it, so then we can, and sorry, the question for all of you at home is, what is a COPS issue? A COPS issue is a certificate of participation, and that means that we are leasing the land that the building sits on, even though we own it. So we're issuing debt against that land, paying it off over time, and then that allows us to finance the building that's sitting on the land. That's also a reason why the district split up the parcels, and that was just approved in this last meeting, where we could split up the parcels to separate where the athletic facility is going to be from the stadium and from the issue that is already issued for the middle school, because we're not allowed to issue debt on an OFCC project. So that's why we had to split that apart. It's a loan. It's a loan, but it's called a lease purchase. That's just the technical term for it, but it is a loan. And then as we look forward here, we have a work session coming up on Monday where we're going to be discussing with the board potential impacts and really trying to get the vision of the board going forward. So allowing them to define really what is palatable for them, and seeking that vote to go forward for a resolution of necessity that will be presented to the board at the April meeting, which would kick off the levy process. Again, I'm getting ready to get into the forecast, I promise. I just want to reiterate, it is only the general fund. So I know you've seen this slide, but I just want to reiterate that and kind of set the stage before we get into it. So I want to talk about what a 5-year forecast is. You'll see right here in the red area, that's 3 actual years of data. And over here in the forecasted area, this is going to be the forecast for the current year going out 5 years, hence the name 5-year forecast. When we look at our forecast right now, the black area is our total revenue, and that is showing 1 year of actual here and then 5 years of projection. The gray is the expenditures. So as you can see, the gray area takes over the black area. It affects the yellow area, which is the cash. So as gray overtakes the black, the yellow drops. And so we're projected to have a negative 6.4 million cash shortfall in the 26-27 school year if we did nothing at this point. When we look at surplus versus shortfall, this is a really nice graphic because it goes back to the 2018-19 school year. It shows 4.8 million, and then in the 19-20 school year, the district ended the fiscal year with $2,773 revenues above expenditures. So very, very close to break even. In the 2020-21 school year, you could see that there was a deficit, and then that projected deficit spending over revenue going out to 2027. So I just want to reiterate here, this is cash balance. This number you're seeing here is the expenditures over revenue that's creating that negative dollar amount. Yes. And we had, there was actually an order to actually continue paying the staff when there was that shutdown in the 19-20 school year, which is right here. We did continue to pay staff during that time. Okay. Also, I want to say here in the 2021 school year, before I go forward, Governor DeWine actually cut the revenue in that year. And then that was basically just because of the uncertainty of the state revenue during COVID. And in this fiscal year right here, what ended up happening was there was an additional cut, and then the governor gave back half of the cuts. So there's a lot of ins and outs that were going in the 2020-21 school year that need to be shown, and I think I have a better way of showing it here in a little bit, but it's just important to note that these years right here were affected by revenue cuts due to COVID. Yes? Staff was working, correct. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So there's a point made here. Thank you so much. That's an excellent point. Yeah, Mr. Spicer, do you want to jump in? Or? There you go.
Yes.
So there was a point made that staff was working during the actual quarantine section of the 19-20 school year. And I want to point that out because, yes, there was remote instruction that was happening, but there's also work that would be done that maybe wasn't happening from like a classified standpoint. And so we were instructed to continue paying those staff members. So thank you for that clarification. It's a very good point.
Yeah, if you just raise your hand, I'll run the microphone to you.
Awesome. So as we look at the March forecast to the last filed forecast, which in this case was February, when you look at this, the only difference that you'll see is the operating transfers out. And this is due to the altered spending plan or borrowing plan or loan, which is that COPS issue. When we look at what impact did the COPS issue have on our projected cash balance, it had a $13.8 million impact on that cash balance over the 5 years that we're measuring in the 5-year forecast. Another way to look at this as well, the red area is the forecast that was filed in February that had us going negative, cash negative, in between fiscal year 25 and 26. The gray area is the amount of impact of that COPS issue to keep our cash balance positive longer. So it essentially bought us a year of a positive cash balance. Now we're going to get into revenues. So basically my thought here is I'm going to work from the top of the forecast down. Revenues are at the top, expenditures are at the bottom. When we look at our revenues at a glance, you'll notice here between 22, which is an actual year of data we have, and 27, there's not much change that happens here in our representation. This is just a visual representation bar chart of our revenues. You can see there's a bump here between fiscal year 22 and 23, but other than that, it's fairly flat. When we now I'm going to kind of break down all of the major impact points of revenues. So when we look at property taxes, it's interesting that between 2022 and 2027, it's the same percentage. And you're probably looking at this change right here and wondering what happened. What happened was when Mr. Rabe forecasted, he utilized tangible personal property tax and property taxes in the same line. Those are actually forecasted at different rates. So what I wanted to do is break those two apart. So you'll see that there's a drop here in property taxes, but in the personal utility, personal property, you'll notice it goes from nothing here and it comes up. So you can see that where we started forecasting that what we call PUP property. Okay? So essentially, I took it away from one line, put it into another line because they're forecasted at different rates. The tangible personal property is actually being phased out. That was something that was passed in 2005 by the General Assembly. So it's just important to know that those are, again, projected at different rates. When we look at state restricted aid, I really want to draw your attention here to 19 to 20. This is due to the cuts that I just talked about that Governor DeWine levied on all Ohio school districts. Notice it comes up slightly. It comes up slightly because we were given some of those cuts back. Then in 22, the Fair School Funding Plan kicks in. So between these 2 years, notice there's a drop in unrestricted aid, and then it's very flat from that point on. When we look at restricted aid, notice it goes from $647,000 in the 2020-21 school year to 21-22 school year, going up to 2.5. So essentially, we had less unrestricted money that we can use however the board decides to use it, and more restricted money. That restricted money is success and wellness related, so it's economic disadvantage funding, it's mental health supports, and that's all we can use that restricted money for. So we get tested on this. We have to provide reports to the state on how we utilize those funds. Again, looking at the Fair School Funding Plan, this is another way to look at it. In fiscal year 21, the Fair School Funding Plan was not in effect. In fiscal year 22, it was. This green area represents restricted. The tan area represents unrestricted. So you can see that funding went up about $30,000 overall, but lots more restricted than unrestricted. This replaced funds that we were getting in the last biennium budget that went outside of the general fund. So we did not benefit, I guess the the theme here is we did not benefit from the Fair School Funding Plan. We just didn't. Part of the reason why we didn't is because we're a guarantee school district. So the guarantee basically means that we get the same amount of funding that we got from fiscal year 21. Fun fact, the fiscal year 21 budget was tied back to the fiscal year 19 budget because the state legislature, or the General Assembly at that time, did not want to do anything to the 20 and 21 budget. So you could draw the conclusion that we're being funded on 2018-19 dollars right now in 2023. You will also notice this is the number of school districts that are on the guarantee. So we're looking at about 248 districts that are on the guarantee, which means they're not being funded at a formula level, which is called the Fair School Funding Formula. Again, we did not benefit from this. What does the guarantee mean to the district? When you look at these amounts, we're currently getting $23 million from, we're getting $23 million based off of the phase-in of the Fair School Funding Plan. And I want to stop for a second. When the Fair School Funding Plan went into effect in the fiscal year 22, it was a 6-year phase-in. It was planned to be 6 years, but they can't marry themselves, and they, as the General Assembly, cannot marry themselves to 6 years because there are multiple biennium budgets. And they can't just make a promise over multiple biennium budgets to fund this. So it's really every 2 years we're learning what the next phase-in is. So when we look at the phased-in currently, this would be year 2 of the Fair School Funding Plan. If we did not have the guarantee, we would be over $5 million less in funding. So the guarantee is helping us because that would be over $5 million year over year over year that the district will be losing. That brings us to the end of revenues. Are there any questions?
So the guaranteed schools, who decided that? How was it decided or factored or?
I think what happened was there were so many different versions of the Fair School Funding Plan. And it went through multiple different variations. And when they got to the last variation, they realized that 248 school districts were going to be negatively impacted. So then that became part of the budget, was to create this guarantee to not negatively affect all those districts. That's a good question. So now we'll get into expenditures. When we look at our expenditures over 1 year of actual, which is the last year of actual we have is the fiscal year 22, and we look forward 5 years to 2027, notice that benefits actually make up a larger percentage of the projection for fiscal year 27, and salaries a little bit smaller, and purchase services are a little bit smaller. That's not to say that purchase services aren't going to cost more in 5 years. It's just that benefits and the growth that we're expecting for the cost of those benefits are going to overtake those other areas. When we look at salaries.
John,
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, hold on.
What are your purchase services?
Purchase services, so we have a contract with Peterman. So we're purchasing that service of busing. It could be when we get a roof replaced, that's a purchase service. And I'm actually going to show what happened with the roofing project from a couple years ago in just a second, but that's what a purchase service is. Supplies are going to be that area up there, real small yellow area. So we look at salaries. Again, you'll see this percentage actually goes down. It's not to say that there's not growth here. Those are going to be growth through our step motions that occur in our negotiated agreements, and also percentages of base that would be negotiated with our unions. So that's kind of, that projection is how I'm building and seeing those salaries over years. We look at benefits. Again, this growth right here, and this is not different from what Mr. Rabe actually forecasted in November, is based off of what we're hearing from our insurance consultants, is that we're currently expecting 10% increases year over year in benefits. This area right here is of concern to me because that's not sustainable. And so we're looking at anything we can possibly do to keep a high quality health benefits for our staff, but figuring out how to mitigate this cost. Yes?
John, on average, outside of the education sector, the fact that we are in a consortium, the average increase per year is double, 3 times typically the 10%?
Yes, and it's actually different when you look at different consortiums. So there was a nearby district several years, not several, like I think 2 or 3 years ago, that got a 25% increase in benefits in 1 year. Yes.
A consortium would be a group of 8 to 10 school districts that come together to create a buying power.
So it's basically.
No, we do.
We do.
That's my point. My point is we're part of a consortium. 10%, while it may seem a lot, outside the industry of this consortium, it's 25, 30% is what the increases that they are seeing.
Yeah,
So
and let me take a second. There are a lot of different consortiums too. We are in one that the districts hold one another accountable for mitigating costs. And part of that is educating our staff. And I just actually met with our benefits coordinator today. And we want to make sure we're educating our staff to do things that help keep our benefits low. Part of that, we just went through biometric training where we have, I think we were told we have by far the best percentage in our consortium of staff that are actually going out and proactively doing testing, blood testing, several different types of testing that would identify any kind of long-term illnesses so they could be addressed now as opposed to down the road when they're going to cost more. So there are other consortiums that let any district in. The consortium we're in is it vets the districts before they even come in. So that's important to know. The district that I was referring to that had a 25% increase was in a different consortium, not ours. So I think that's where the confusion was. But when we look forward again to our purchase services, when you're looking at this, you're like, what in the world happened in 2021? Roofing projects. So I believe that was a roofing projects for our 4-pack, which is one of the building we're in right now. So that's what spiked. And I'm going to get into why this would be impacting the general fund later, but the little bit of information is that we don't have a large portion of PI funds coming into the district, and so I'll get to that in just a bit. When we look at the expenditure comparisons from February to March, this was prior to using that COPS financing. This is with utilizing the COPS financing. So you can see the expenditures do go up, but it's much flatter than what we experience right here. Also, we talked about the Fair School Funding Plan and how it affects revenues, and let's talk about how it affects expenditures. So part of the Fair School Funding Plan is it created a base cost. And when you look at this base cost, it's $7,258, and each district has its own unique base cost. So that is our base cost here in Milford. At the bottom, you can see that the state funds 32%, where it expects locally 68% of that base cost to come into play. Over here is kind of the explanation, the really short explanation of what base cost is. But again, it's using student-teacher ratios, minimum staffing levels, and actual costs from the 18-19 school year. Lots of things have happened since the 18-19 school year. And so the district is basically being asked to fund itself on 5-year-old revenues. When I saw that base cost, I initially thought, okay, well, how are we doing when we compare ourselves with other districts? So I looked at the CUP report from 2021, because at the time that was the only piece of data that was out. The 22 actually just came out. When you look at the 2021 CUP report, ODE, which is Ohio Department of Education, identifies districts that are like us. And we can go up to 20 different districts that are like us. But I took the top 5. And when I look at those top 5, you can see that we are sitting below the average, which is 12,332.87. So we're actually the second lowest in that grouping. I also know that a lot of people, this doesn't matter to a lot of people because you might not know where their school districts are. So I like to compare with local districts. So I used Indian Hills, Sycamore, Loveland, Goshen, Forest Hills, Oak Hills, and West Claremont. And we're the third lowest in that grouping. The average actually goes up to $13,081.22 per student. And we're sitting at $11,743.80. There's also another piece to look at because it's not all about how much we're spending, it's what are we getting. And I hate using ROI. I've said this before at board meetings. I don't like using ROI when it comes to, or return on investment when it comes to education, but I'm going to do it here. And you look and you can see that our performance index is at 95. And then looking at that, 11,430.95 operating expenditures per pupil. When we plot this, this is telling us what the average is right here in this grouping, and it's telling us what the average performance index score is here. We are sitting right here, right at the average in that group, but below average in cost. And so when you look at this, it took me a long time when I looked at this, but I really kind of came out with no one spends less and achieves more in this grouping. And this is our local grouping. This is in here with Sycamore, Indian Hill, Forest Hills, Loveland. So in this section, I think that's an interesting piece of data to look at when it comes to our expenditures per pupil and the performance index. Finally, I want to look at forecast trends, and I promise I'm going to zoom in on this, but I just wanted to show you, if you were looking at the forecast, we're looking at this line down here, 6.010, which is excess of revenues over expenditures. And when we look at this, as I talked about before, there is a trend now of spending more than we're taking in. But you can also look back to the 1920 school year and say we were really close to spending more than we took in that year. So it's really several years when you go back and look at that trend. I wanted to look at fiscal distress because this is something that we get measured on if we were to continue to go down the road of spending more. And it's not so much just about our cash balance, it's how quickly our expenditures over revenues overtake our cash on hand. So it's really a percentage when we look at the percentage of that overage of expenditures over revenues and our cash. The February forecast had us next fiscal year starting in warning and ending up in emergency by the 24-25 school year. By changing that financing to that COPS issue or that borrowing, we're able to actually keep the district up here in the green area touching caution in the 24-25 school year, and then ending in the 25-26 in emergency if there was no other revenue coming in. Mr. Spicer?
John, could you talk about in 26 what happens if no issue is passed in 26, what happens in fiscal emergency?
Well, I think what we first talk about is 24-25. If we did nothing, the state would get involved and start asking us to create reports of how we're going to cut costs. And if we were to bring ourselves out of that distress label, that would be it. We would just go on. If we weren't, and we go into emergency in 25, 26, the state really gets involved, and they start telling us what we have to cut. I know, Mr. Spicer, I think you went through it right, or you might have left Little Miami right before it happened, but do you want to talk about that at all?
Yes. I mean, what happens is the state comes in and says, you don't have to have art, music, and PE at elementary schools, and so you don't have to have that so you begin to cut those programs. You don't have to have AP courses at the high school, so you can start to cut those. And so what I have said is we cannot cut our way to the deficit that we are in. The deficit is too great to begin to say, well, you need to cut X amount of teachers. That won't work. We can't. We are pretty darn close to being as lean as we can be without being malnourished. And so I believe that we have to decide as a Milford community, what is it that we want? Do we want art, music, and PE for our kids at the elementary schools? Do we want, do we want those programs for our kids? What kind of experience we want them to have when they're here at school? And so that's the decision that ultimately will have to be made.
So can you just expand a little bit on that? So when I hear cutting teachers and classes and stuff, that's an, oh no, I don't want that to happen. But what about the other areas of the school business? Because there are expenses that are associated with the administration that are not the teaching staff, or not the gold that we want to keep. Yep. You know, is there overhead, or is there any way to cut any of that? I understand that it won't get the solution there, but are there things that we could do to lean up a little bit and get through this hard time?
We are going to look at those as well. The state looks at, like elementaries, for instance. Once you get to 500 students, you should have, not required, but you should have an assistant principal. We don't have assistant principals in any of our elementary schools. That's something that we should have, but we don't. So I would contend that administratively, if you look at those comparative schools, we're probably below average on that. But we are, John and I are looking at those and working with the board. So yes, the answer is yes.
I think we're also looking at purchase services too. We're evaluating every contract. So we're looking at our contracts and identifying, maybe this worked a couple years ago and it's not needed anymore. So that's part of that process too. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more. And that's really what Monday is going to be about, an open discussion about, the vision of the board and figuring out how we get to an agreeable number. This looks crazy, but just follow me for a second. Stick with me. I promise I'll get you through it. This is the November forecast for all of those local districts that I just talked about. I think I added Marymount. That's the there's one extra on there, which they're down here. This is showing caution, watch, and emergency. This is the November forecast, so it's basically looking at where the district was and where they're projected to be in fiscal year 27. Now, I am not able to compare the forecast that I just filed from March because all of the other districts haven't updated their forecasts like we have. But in May, once those are out, I'll be able to show you this and see where all the other districts fall. But I think it's just interesting when you look at this. We're not the only one in this situation. There are other districts that are having to go on the ballot to keep the essentially keep the lights on, and so there's some. I saw some of you looking at this one. That's Sycamore, and I'll tell you that they're another district that I don't believe has a permanent improvement levy. So there's spikes in expenditures that are causing that. But you know, that's another, you know, we're in Milford, so I'm not going to spend a long time talking about Sycamore. But I think this is just interesting. Even Indian Hill is coming down, although they're not going into one of the fiscal distresses. The other thing that's interesting is half of the districts are down here in emergency in year 5 of their forecasts. So some key takeaways here. Deficit spending began for the district in the 2021 school year, although 1920 was pretty close. The May 2013 operating levy is stretched for 10 years, 6 more than the deliverable of 4 years that was promised at that time. And you might ask, how in the world did you stretch something that was supposed to last 4 for 10? It's because typically, when there have been funding changes, it's been advantageous for the district. The Fair School Funding Plan was not advantageous for the district. We are continuing to look at further efficiencies, and I say continuing on purpose because ever since I've been here, I've had conversations, whether it be with our executive cabinet or just talking to other administrators, how can we do this and be more efficient? And how can we do it without affecting programs and save money? So that's part of what I stand for, and that's part of something that we continue to do. We are going to be bringing some efficiencies that we've identified on Monday for the board, and making sure that they know that what those mean and what the bottom line is for those efficiencies, as well as engaging in further conversation. And then, you know, really what's going to come out of that is we're going to identify the priorities of the board and also the efficiencies that the administration brings, and then I'm going to have to bring a number that coincides with that in terms of the levy ask for November. This was something I showed at the board meeting in March. I took, my family owns property. I grew up in Milford. You know, family came here in the 40s. So I went back on the property that we own and actually pulled down all of the tax issues. I took the bonds out because we're talking about operating levies here. But when we're looking at the operating levies, there's been 10 years, which is by far the most years between these operating levies. And obviously, the board still has to make a vote to put something on in November, but it's been 10 years from this point since the last operating levy that I just talked about. The average is 4.125. And I alluded to this earlier, permanent improvement. This is something that when you look at every district in Claremont and Hamilton County and look at the millage that they have for permanent improvement, we are tied for the lowest. And this 0.5 mil is actually part of an inside mill that was moved in 2010 that's a requirement of OFCC. So OFCC, no matter how many OFCC projects you have in your district, requires a $0.5 mil, and a $0.5 mil for us is $658,000. If you saw that spike from purchase services that we were talking about with the roofing project, several $1 million for that. So I think that that's important to know. And really what it comes down to, and I've actually heard questions like, I didn't know that you could use general fund money for capital expenditures or capital upkeep. And the answer is without a permanent improvement levy or any other income coming into that, there's no other place for it to come from. Yes?
Can you explain what permanent improvement, what qualifies for what a permanent improvement-ish thing is?
Thank you for asking that, because I use these terms every day, and I know that, you know, you're probably getting inundated with information. So if you have questions, I'm going to show my website URL here in a minute, and you can ask me questions if you have them. Be happy to answer them later. But permanent improvement is something that's expected to last for 5 years or more. So it could be a pavement project, it could be asphalt, it could be a roofing project, it could be building a building that lasts 5 years or more. It could even be some districts that I've been in prior have used PI levies for curriculum purchases, because if that adoption is over 5 years or more, you can use it for that too. So it's not just buildings or, or things like that, but for us, it really equates to buildings.
And so the permanent improvement millage that is up there, let's just take the top one, 5.75 mils. Marymount City has a 5.75 mil permanent improvement levy that's out there alongside of
Operating
their
levies.
operating
Yes.
expenses as well.
And so when money, if money were to flow into a permanent improvement fund, it can only be used for those items. It stands in a fund separate from the general fund.
So Milford does not have a PI fund, or we have a fund, but we don't have a PI millage out there.
We don't have any money flowing into our 003 PI fund. We actually have to put it into a classroom and facilities fund, which is the 034 fund. So no, we do not have any money flowing into our permanent improvement fund. And again, the lack of those PI funds are really causing us to have to go out and use a general fund for these expenditures. Just a few other items. We're value engineering everything. You know, you heard me talk about the middle school. At one point, this thing was $20 million over budget. It was before I got here, so I would have had a lot more gray hair if I heard that number at that point. But it was $20 million. It's gotten down to 7.5, although we expect it to be 9.5 by the time we're done with that project. So when we're value engineering, we're looking at all the inputs, and Mr. Johnson is doing that alongside Mr. Spicer and the team to identifying cost savings measures. We're also looking for naming rights for the athletic facility to help offset some of those costs of that COPS issue, those payments. You know, I was talking to one of the board members, and they were telling me that I think it took 6 or 7 years of income for the athletic boosters for a turf project. So the idea that someone's just going to swoop in and drop $12.5 million on an athletic facility is awesome, and I would love it, and I would love to be able to cash that check for the school district. It's just, we haven't seen that at this point. That's not to say that we're not trying. I've gone out and used some personal connections that I have to meet with some individuals with Mr. Spicer, and we have ongoing conversations to do that to help offset that cost. And finally, we're going to be identifying these cost savings measures again with the board on Monday, and hopefully coming to an idea of where that millage is going to look at the end of that meeting. I just want to thank you all for being here. That's a QR code that takes you to the website for me. I'm doing things called Money Matters, which are just little short videos that I'm going to be putting out. The next one will be coming out on Friday. So they're every other week. They go out on social media for the district. They're also found on the website for me. I'll also be posting this presentation on the website as well, so you can access it. And did you have a question, sir?
So for revenues, no taxes are popular, right? But this community seems especially averse to property tax increases. So I've wondered this for a while. Has the district ever considered a school district income tax?
Let me answer that question first, and then you can talk about the reasons or what it needs to get there. The answer is yes. There have been board members that have brought that up, but I don't know that there's been enough board members to get there, if that makes sense.
From a mechanical standpoint, I've been in a district that had a school district income tax before. That was a traditional one. You know, I think that it could work here. The issue is it typically takes 3 years to ramp up the revenues to get that going. So typically, when the district is coming out and saying that they're in a have fiscal issues, it's too late to do that. It would have been an awesome conversation to have 3 years ago or 4 years ago to be able to ramp up. But you know, to Mr. Spicer's point, I don't know that the board at that time was there.
Are there other questions? Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Where do we get the money to pay back the loan, for the COPS loan?
So that's going to be transfers. We're going to have to transfer money from the general fund into the PI fund and make the payment from there. So that, basically what I'm saying with that is if we were to be able to get some naming rights, we would deposit that money into the PI fund, and we would be able to transfer less money to make that payment. It's basically, if you think you've got a checking account and a savings account personally, it's which account are you paying it out of? Any other questions? Yeah.
I'd like to know what kind of magic you're going to use to talk to people who've lost their jobs during COVID and now have a tax levy put on them that I hear is quite heavy. And what will they get out of a new athletic center?
So I'm not here to talk about people's personal finances, and everyone is going to have a decision to make, and I respect that decision. When I look at what I've been tasked to do is identified a millage in January and February, and the board has now directed me to lower that millage. So we're finding ways to, with every efficiency, that millage drops. So I did identify 8.51 mils when I got here because that's what it would cost given everything I knew at that point. But we're working to lower that.
I'll answer that question for you. So what we have done is John and I and Krista have met with 3 state reps, and I would encourage you to do so as well. The fair school funding formula doesn't work. They passed it. Jean Schmidt, we've met with her, and before that fair school funding formula ever passed, I met with her prior to and said, this will not benefit Milford. It will actually hurt us, and it still passed. So it's going to have to be a grassroots effort of everyone reaching out to Jean Schmidt and Terry Johnson, who is the state senator. They have to fix it. It's unconstitutional. It's been that way for 20 plus years, and they've yet to fix it. So that's the real issue. I'm going to come back over here, but here first.
So if we reach out to Jean Smith, what are we asking her?
You're going to ask her to fix the funding formula and fix school funding in general. You're also going to let her know that there's $6 billion in the rainy day fund. That is your money, not theirs. Why are we sitting on $6 billion? They need to fund education properly. That's what needs to happen. And I've met her, and I've told that to her, and so it won't be a surprise if she hears from you, and she gets the same kind of wording. But that's what needs to happen. Yes. Yes, John had that up there. It's 6832.
Yes, 6832.
6832. So, and that changes by district. So some districts pay way more locally, and some pay way less. So
There are also
we're considered a wealthy district. Now, I don't think anybody in this room thinks we're a wealthy school district, but we are considered a wealthy school district.
I will also say that state law requires that districts that really shouldn't be getting any state revenue get 5%. So there are districts that could fully operate on local money to get 5%. And if you add all those 5% up, that's money that could be coming here to Milford. We've met with Adam Bird, with Adam Matthews.
Gene Schmidt.
Yeah.
Oh, and Donnie. So 4 of them. Thank you.
4.
4 of them, not 3. We've met with.
Give me that one. Give me the one.
We've met with 4 of them. We will continue to do so. It has to be a grassroots effort. It can't just be John and 2 other superintendents. What we have heard is, we never hear from our constituents. They don't contact us. So I'm encouraging you to do so. I'm encouraging you to contact those that are on the primary and secondary education committee. Yes, thank you.
Richardson.
Richardson. Yes, Richardson is the
I will also say this, in the last town hall that I did, we actually had takeaways. And what I'll do is I'll add that slide or those 2 slides to the end of this presentation when it gets online. And it specifically says, here's what we need in terms of what we're asking our state legislators to do. So we'll put that there for you.
Are there other questions?
I just want to comment to your comment that we seem to be a tax-averse community. We passed a huge levy. and to see another huge levy come our way is just daunting. And I have to tell you, coming here and listening to the information is very helpful to understand a little bit broader of the perspective, but I would believe that there's a large percentage out there that are like, we just passed a huge levy. Had we known that we were fiscally not stable, I'm not sure that that levy that passed would have passed. We would have been looking more toward this levy as the most important. So that, I just want to speak to that. It's not an averse community. It's that it's all coming like heavily, all very short term together.
Just a few comments about that. So I know some of these folks have been here a lot longer than I have, and I did arrive in '94, and I left and I came back. This district is adverse to property taxes. I mean, to get something passed here since the early '90s, you've probably been here, or '90s, early '90s. So it's tough. It's tough anywhere. There's a difference between a bond and a levy. We just passed a bond to build buildings. A bond is for buildings. So B, buildings, bond, buildings. Levy is for operating. And when we were discussing that bond issue to try to get it passed, I said, no matter what happens with this bond, pass or fail, we will be back in 2 years to ask for more money to operate. So it doesn't negate anything that you said. We knew that we were going to be back in 2 years to try to pass a levy to operate. And I do think, to be fair, I do believe this district is super efficient. Doesn't mean we can't get a little bit leaner, but we don't do extravagant things. Nothing we have is extravagant in this district. So I don't believe that, and I know we cannot cut our way to the deficit that we are in. We just cannot cut our way. That can't happen. There aren't positions to cut to get us there. In order for us to get just 1 mil off of there, to drop it from just 1 mil would be 20 teachers. And I don't know that we have 20 teachers to cut. So as a school community, we have to decide what kind of school district we want to have and what to do. Morris, first.
I just have a quick question. Can you put that messy blue line slide? Because I think the story that this tells, it went like this. This tells me that Ohio is funding schools in such a way that no matter if you have, some of these places have buildings, some of these new operating levies or new fancy buildings or whatever, some don't. Some are extremely wealthy and some are not. But this tells me that Ohio is not funding schools if nobody has a line that keeps them out of yellow or worse.
I also want to point out, when you look at this district right here, they've got a school district income tax, 1%.
One other thing that I would like to kind of, there was a question or comment about COVID and people losing jobs, et cetera. My wife is a small business owner. She had over 25 employees, and within 2 weeks lost everything. And cut it down to 3 or 4 employees, kept the doors open for them, and
Does anyone else have any other questions? Yes.
Agrees with you. My question is about the backpack bill. It seems to have momentum in Columbus. If it passes, it starts 2024, 2025 school year. Where is that in your forecast?
It's not in my forecast, but neither is House Bill 1. And so when we're looking at these items, I can't forecast something that hasn't happened yet. So, you know, we're monitoring. I get weekly, probably bi-weekly monitors on these specific items, but it could have a detrimental effect on the district.
I believe that if the backpack bill passes, that it could certainly impact us. I do believe we're a destination district. I'm not sure that folks are going to be leaving. But if they do leave, where are they going to go? I think that's the bigger issue. Is there space for them to go to? I would contend also that the backpack bill, if your dollars are going to follow your child to a parochial school, that parochial school is going to raise their tuition because they don't have the space to take these children. So I'm not as concerned about that in terms of losing people. I think we're a destination district. I think people are going to come, they're going to want to come here. But again, if you're leaving, where are you going? And do they have the space? Because I'm not sure they have this physical space to take students there. I think this is John's opinion. This is a bait and switch. This is for people that are already sending their kids to parochials and charters, privates, whatever. I think they're going to raise the tuition in those places anyway.
From what I've read on the backpack bill online, is that it covers homeschooling, which means that parents can just opt out of public and parochial school altogether. My question is, if it negatively impacts us here in 18 months, are you going to come back looking for more money?
Well, do you want to take that, and then I can take it too? I mean, I'm not trying to throw you a hard ball, but
I mean, that's the unknown that we just don't know. And I think that, again, that's a conversation for this community to have with our elected officials to say that this is not a good idea. I would also say that homeschooling is not for everyone. That doesn't mean that people will take advantage of it and use it. I don't think we can predict what that's going to be. So what I do know is the state requires us to run a budget, right? I mean, so that's, I think you really got to talk to your legislators about that bill.
I also want to point out, and this is a slide that I showed at the first town hall as well. I can make sure it gets in here. The district has a track record of reacting to enrollment changes, and that's done with staffing levels with those enrollment changes. You can look all the way back to 2008, I think, is what's on that chart, and that doesn't mean that we have to RIF teachers. That means that we react when there's a retirement or a resignation. We figure out how to reallocate those resources if the enrollment drops. So you can see on that chart, there's a lot of interplay, and it's mirroring itself. When the enrollment goes up, staffing goes up proportionally. When it goes down, it drops proportionally. But my goal is to not come back to you, just so I can go on record as saying that, not to come back to you and ask for additional funding for something like the backpack bill. Or something like the backpack.
So I think what is important is John's 5-year forecast. If this community is so inclined to pass a levy in November, we'll be back in 3 years.
I mean, this is for 3 years, projected right now. We don't know what's going to happen. Hopefully we get another stretch where we can stretch it 10 years. I would love to be able to do that. I just know that if the Fair School Funding Plan remains in effect right now, we're looking at 3 years.
Yes, ma'am.
Maybe now it's time to put in for the income tax instead of coming back for another levy.
I would totally like to get that conversation started.
Earned income tax.
Earned, yes.
We would prefer, the conversations would be an earned income tax that will not affect those that retire on Social Security. That would choose an earned income tax.
Yep. Well, if there aren't any other questions, we'll go ahead and end, but I'll be up here if you have any questions. Just come up. If you want to reach out via email or on the phone or set up a meeting, totally happy to do that as well. But I just really appreciate you all coming this evening and learning a little bit about where we are as a district and really the why behind a lot of this, hopefully. So thank you all very much.